Well, good evening to everybody, and thank you for being with us. I'm Peter Gives, Director of A Faith That Does Justice, and we are delighted tonight to have as our guest Dr. Jim O'Connor. And I'd like to just mention briefly that A Faith That Does Justice, what we seek to do is to raise consciousness about social issues that affect vulnerable people. And with that in mind, we're really talking tonight about homelessness, and we could probably have no better guest than Dr. Jim O'Connor. So, Jim, thank you for being with us tonight, and welcome.
It's great to be here, Peter.
Okay. Well, thank you. And before we begin, too, I just want to say that there are a couple of books out. Jim has a book, Stories from the Shadows, written in 2015, Reflections of a Street Doctor, worth reading. And then there's one that has just come out by Tracy Kidder called Rough Sleepers. And a number of people have just read that, and I've gotten some very positive feedback on that. So as we begin, I'd like to just set the context of the evening for our audience. We're speaking about homelessness in Boston, but this is an issue that really is a problem for the entire United States and perhaps for most of the world. To set the context, I'd like to just say that there's been a recent annual report from the Housing and Urban Development, which would estimate that there are 580,000 people who are homeless on any given night in this country. 60% of these people live in shelters, but it leaves about 250,000 on our streets homeless on any given night. And so first question I'd just like to ask Jim is this a tremendous number of people, 250,000 approximately, is this a linear increase over time, or are we seeing, has there been a tremendous explosion at some point along the way?
Interesting question, Peter. And I think the short answer is it's been a linear progression over time. It's a complicated picture, though, because that one night point in time count is like a snapshot. Yeah. And so it doesn't give us much of what happens during the course of a year, like how many people that are out there tonight will not be there tomorrow or a month from now. So that's what we always think of as a one night estimate, and it's a low number because it's obviously much more than that during the course of the year. But if you study carefully the most recent report, the good news is that in many cities across the country, the numbers are slowly turning and going down. The bad news is in some of our larger urban settings, especially on the West Coast, LA and San Francisco, the numbers seem to be going up. And so the total number is going up, although there are pockets of hope as you look around the country.
Okay, very nice. Okay, so as we begin, then I'd like to really start more at the personal level that, you're a physician who came out of some very sophisticated training in the Harvard system. And then if you could just share briefly the story. Here you were trained, I believe, as a hematology oncology fellow, and maybe looking at a career that way, and were asked to take a year and do something different. If you could just talk a little bit about what that was about. And I know you had a number of mentors who were nurses, Barbara McGinnis being one. So can you just lead us through a little bit about what was this initiation into this very different way of treating patients?
Oh, absolutely. And it just underscores for me when I think back on my career now how big a role serendipity has played, if not luck. What in truth, I never became a hematologist or oncologist. I had planned on that. So I finished my residency. I finished my internal medicine residency. And it just happened in one of those accidents of history that the city of Boston was getting a grant to try to take care of homeless people. And the people who were homeless, who were involved with the mayor in putting this grant together, demanded a full-time doctor. And it was hard to find one. And so my chief of medicine, who's a wonderful man named John Potts, and another wonderful doctor at Mass General named Tom Durant, called me into their office. And when I was in March of my senior year, and as you know all too well, when your chief of medicine calls you into the office, the questions are kind of rhetorical. So he said, I have a great idea for you for a year. So he delayed my fellowship for a year, and I said, yes, I would do this for a year. So I started knowing nothing of homelessness. In fact, I thought Pine Street Inn, which is our largest shelter here in Boston, was for years. I thought it was an inn. I had no idea it was like a shelter. So I'll never forget leaving Mass General. I had spent most of June as the senior resident in charge of the ICU, and thought, how tough can it be to go down to a shelter clinic 6 blocks down the street? I should be a piece of cake. And two real comeuppance came there. One is I walked into the shelter thinking they were going to be glad they had a doctor. I was going to be the first full-time doctor. And there was this clinic of really fiercely independent, social justice thinking nurses who had been running a clinic there for years. And they weren't particularly interested in having a snooty doctor show up, especially from an ivory tower. So they kind of read me the Riot Act, which I could tell you about, where I ended up soaking feet for 2 months. They wouldn't let me be a doctor. I had to do what the nurses do, engage people by taking time, being present, and soaking their feet. And the second thing I had to come to grips with was this was much harder medicine than I was seeing in the ICU, because in the ICU, I had control of everything. You could turn up a dial, take something off, put in a line. But here it was, an outbreak of multi-drug tuberculosis that was affecting 60 people. The AIDS epidemic had just hit the homeless population, and it was really complicated medicine.
Yeah, I bet. And I know that as the program developed, I heard you say recently at a talk that Boston Healthcare for the Homeless as a program is really more about justice than it is charity. What do you mean by that?
When we started, I had every friend I knew that was willing, all ready to volunteer and help out. I had my friends that were going into specialty care to come try and help. And when I started out, I was shocked, actually, to learn that the homeless people who put us together had come up with a document declaring that we needed to be about social justice and not charity. It was a hail and door signed document, signed by the chiefs of medicine and the mayor. And through their eyes, they were looking to be treated like everybody else. They didn't want volunteers and charity people like me who were there to do good. I was going to do my give back for a year. This was my year to do something good. And they hated do-gooders like me. And what they really wanted was the same thing all of us want, a doctor and a team and nurses and stuff who would be with them consistently over time. And they were all about continuity of care. And they thought, volunteers and charity sort of broke that continuity in a way that they did not appreciate.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then if we go more than looking at the causes, in Boston, I've been in Boston, I've lived in Boston several different times during the course of my life. And what always intrigues me in more recent years is the number of homeless people that are here in the winter. I've lived in California for a while, and I can certainly understand why people are there in the winter. It's much easier. But the causes and what drives them, are most of these people local, or are they coming in? It's a mix of people from different parts.
Yeah. It is a mix, but in general, I would say that most of the people we take care of stay here because this is their neighborhood, their home. Even though they don't have a house in there, this is where they grew up, and this is what they know. And I have often struggled with that same thing, Peter, that staying outside on a winter night here in Boston is really difficult. Yeah. And I would head for a warm climate or something, but they seem to, this is their territory. This is where they feel, most grounded, even though they're at great risk for exposure to weather and extremes of weather, etc. Yeah. So, no, there's much controversy. Most cities think that the homeless people that come to your city are coming from outside the city to use the services. And every time we've done a real deep dive into that, it's not true. There is some people that will come because Boston has wonderful shelters and meals and stuff like that. So there are some people that come, but the vast majority grew up somewhere in this area.
Okay, very interesting. And the causes, no doubt it's multifactorial, but what leads to someone being on the street, and what are the challenges in terms of being able to help them? Who are these people, that they wind up on the street with really so little?
It's important because I think if you step back and you look at homeless people, the big picture, many people are homeless because they, just lost their job, or they were burned out of their house, or they had to fled. So many people are homeless, usually not through any fault of their own, but something that a house would then just get them back on their feet again. But I think the people who become chronically homeless, who are out there for long periods of time, either chronically in the shelters, and I should point out that, as you know, Boston has a really rich network, a long-standing history of providing shelter for any adult, anyway, who wants one. The mayors have been from Mayor Flynn, who was the mayor in the original one, through Mayor Menino, through Mayor Walsh, through Mayor Janey, and now to Mayor Wu, have all been incredibly good about making sure people have places to be safe and out of the weather. You know, unlike many cities where there's very few shelters and all people have to stay outside, Boston is not that way. So we have less than 5% of the homeless people are outside. The rest are in shelter.
Wow.
It's a pretty, you know, it's a pretty wonderful testament to
Yeah,
Boston.
my guess
and
would be that's a
environment.
lot higher, I mean, better ratio than many other cities.
Yeah, and I mean in LA, where I've spent some time in Skid Row, you know, there it's reversed. It's probably 80 to 85% of all homeless people are living in tents along the highways
Yeah.
or in Skid Row. So we're lucky with that. But it does mean that the people who are outside here in Boston, you know, are really, for us, a compelling sort of subgroup of the homeless. They're people who could go into the shelter if things were different, but for very complex reasons don't do that and end up risking their lives, basically staying outside. And then and the reasons for that, a legion. The story that was most dramatic for me was, I remember one really cold night early on when I was out in the van with the Pine Street folks, maybe 1986. And it was so bitterly cold. It was a northeaster coming. It was going to snow. It was -5 degrees. And he was sleeping under a bridge along the Charles River. And I was, you know, and I'd gotten to know him a little bit. And I said, come on in just for the night. It's going to be freezing. Can't you come in? And he looked at me really sweetly. And he said, look, Doc, you don't understand. If I go into Pine Street, I can't tell which voices are mine.
Wow.
But when I stay out here, I know which voices are mine and I can handle them. So it began to open up for me that there are very complicated reasons. But it also points out that the people who live outside also, you know, often are struggling with some of the most profound challenges that would break basically you or me, and they are struggling.
Yeah. You know, and along those lines, what strikes me too is, you know, there are issues involved here. Some of it's mental issues, some of it's physical health conditions, and compliance then. How, over time, you've built up confidence with these people, but is compliance still a major problem in terms of people on the street really adhering to any kind of a medical regimen that would help them?
Complicated question. What we have found, and I think this I would attribute to the nurses and the people that put us together, is that if you step back and think about it as continuity of care over time, this is a lesson I had to learn, I didn't know in the beginning, that, for example, most of our first impressions of somebody we meet them turn out to be completely wrong as you get to know them a year later, 6 or 5 years later, or 10 years later. And what we found is it was very hard to get people to agree to do anything we wanted them to do early on. But as we earned their trust, which usually came, you know, with a lot of time soaking their feet, sharing coffee with them, sharing a little bit of yourself, things that we traditionally as doctors are told to keep a little distance. And once they began to trust you, then adherence to what we're asking them to do became really possible. And I would say to a large degree, really quite impressive. So I can give you an example because, you know, I was trained, you know, when I was at Mass General as an intern, we saw our first case of AIDS, first person with AIDS, I should say. And, you know, and we had for the next 14 years, just about everybody died, and it was horrible, as you know. And I just remember sitting through so many deaths with so many people where we were helpless. Inhibitors come along in 1995, 96, and it was like people who were almost dead, and these get back to living a life again. And what we have found in our program with we have a wonderful doctor named Dr. Jen Brody and her nurses. We have probably 500 or 600 people who have HIV, and 90% of them have their viral loads suppressed because they're taking their medicines regularly.
Which would speak to the confidence level that they're willing to take the medicines out of trust.
Exactly. I think there's a return on the investment you make in earning people's trust.
Yeah, how about that? Yeah. And then what about, we talked about this briefly before, women on the street. I mean, that's a tough life, I would imagine. And maybe you can say something about that, the women who are homeless.
Yeah, it kind of breaks your heart, but when we look just at our rough sleepers, which is the name that most of the people on the street like to call themselves a rough sleeper, and it's a old British term. In fact, there's a department of rough sleepers in the British welfare system. But I would say the ratio of men to women is about 4 to 1. So it's a relatively small number of women on the streets. Often they are the ones who face some monumental challenges from all sorts of things. And they become easily victimized on the streets. And plus they are looking for someone to protect them. So it's often a protector who's also victim. So it becomes very complicated. And we worry about, all the stuff that you know well, the trafficking and the victimization. So yes, it's a real problem. Women are vulnerable on the street.
And what about pregnancy? These women on the street who might become pregnant, what happens in that kind of a situation?
Just
with
about
delivery.
It's just about anything you can imagine. So many women, when they become pregnant, actually have access to lots of services that they can. So the family shelters, once you're 5 months pregnant, can bring you in, and those are pretty safe, wonderful places in general. Others choose to try to have the babies, and that can become complicated, especially if there's a serious and persistent mental illness and or active substance use going on. Then it can become very, very complicated.
Yeah, no, I'm sure it is quite complicated. I'll switch a little bit now, maybe to a more generalized view of homelessness. About maybe 4 years ago, Faith That Does Justice, we interviewed Roseanne Haggerty, who I think you know, we've crossed paths. She also deals with homelessness, maybe, as I understand it, maybe more in Connecticut, New York, that kind of an area. And she has this idea, and maybe you share this idea, but I'm just wondering if you'd comment, that the attack or the way to approach homelessness is on a grand scale. You involve everybody who can help, get them to unify their approach, and treat everyone in a very personal way. I suspect that that's something similar to what you're doing. Roseanne talked about this idea that if you can get the city to really, those who are players in the homelessness field, to work together, that tremendous strides can be made. So I just ask you to comment whether you feel that that's the situation in Boston. After she gave that talk, I did speak to some people dealing with homelessness in Boston, and some of them said that view doesn't necessarily apply completely in Boston, that there are complicating factors. So maybe you can clarify a little.
Yeah, no, first of all, Roseanne is one of my heroes. It's somebody who has been thinking way out of the box since I first met her when she was working in Times Square with Common Ground, renovating the Times Square Hotel into one of the most remarkable places for homeless people I've ever seen. But and Roseanne has, really led the country in trying to get people to realize that homelessness is not solved by just one. It's not solved by health or public health or something. But you've got to bring the cities together. And when people are working in unison, then solutions are possible. And she has, in many cities around the country, she now is all over the country, and her group, which is called Community Solutions, has really cut homelessness down often in half, and in some cities almost to nothing, using the things she had. I think the issue still, for many of us, and I imagine this is what the people are saying, is that in some of the really larger cities like Chicago, like LA and San Francisco, especially those with interesting politics, it is really difficult to bring all of those forces together. And the traditions are that these are working in silos, and so trying to bring all that together has been really a challenge. So I think that's the frontier for both Roseanne for sure, and for us, we're anxious to have her help us learn how you can do that in some of these big cities. But she and her team are just stunningly remarkable.
Okay, nice. And I'm sure what you're doing would be of similar quality from what we've seen. What about this Boston city government? You've mentioned the mayors have been very supportive of you. And now on the practical level, what about resources and finances? Do you feel that the work you're doing, are you getting the supports you need to be able to do the work that has to be done? And is there areas or avenues where there could be more support that would produce more of a result?
One of the blessings of my life has been, being planted here in Boston for both medical school and for my job for these last almost 40 years now. So the mayors, as I mentioned before, have been remarkable in their generosity and foresight in addressing the homeless problem. And we've also been blessed by an amazing number of governors who have been fabulous here. Charlie Baker, who is our outgoing governor, was, amazing when he was in the Weld administration and also in his own administration. And now Governor Healy, has wonderful ideas going on. And our Medicaid, Massachusetts Medicaid, if I crawl into our health mode, Medicaid in Massachusetts is, I think, almost unique in the country in its real passion to serve those who are most excluded. So they are looking for creative ways to reach the people that they're supposed to, as opposed to many states that are trying to pull in. So we've been lucky. We have, most homeless people since the Romney administration in Boston have had full Medicaid. Shelters have been funded by, by the feds and by the state. The state does a remarkable job with homeless families. And so we're blessed with all that. We also have a hospital community that has worked closely with the shelter community, and you can't, that's a dream to have those forces together. However, now, do we think we in any way have solved the problem? No. I think we still need, a step back to look at homelessness as really a societal problem that needs federal, state, and city input, but collaboration. And so I think we're working on that. And I think in many ways, Boston is far ahead of many cities because of the wonderful generosity of donors as well. And we, most of our program, we're Medicaid funded primarily, but to take the time we need with people and to, when somebody comes into the clinic or we see under a bridge that we need to spend 3 hours getting them to the oncology clinic, we can take that time because of the donor funding, not because of the Medicaid funding. And time is really one of the most valuable things we have. So I would say we're very lucky to be in Massachusetts. Wonderful to be working with Medicaid, but there is clearly a lot that still needs to be done, particularly in housing and the services that need to come along with housing.
Now, you just mentioned housing. That's my next question. Where are we at in terms of meeting the needs in terms of low income or subsidized housing? How is that shaking out?
I think Boston, along with several other cities, are doing, a remarkable effort to find very low income housing for the people that are at the lowest rung of the income ladder. The problem, of course, is that to get that housing and to get through all the rules and regulations and and standards and community processing and stuff, it takes a lot of work and a lot of time, and consequently, the housing becomes very expensive. So while it's happening in creative ways and we know kind of what works, it's done in a small scale and needs to be scaled to a much larger and much more expensive thing. And I think the political will to do that certainly at a national level and to some degree at other levels is still missing, and we have a lot of work still to do.
Okay, interesting. Now, the next item, people in Boston would know of the mass cast, locus of homeless people. People from outside of Boston may not realize that in other cities perhaps there's the same. But in Boston, it seems to be that there had been a tremendous density of homeless people concentrated in one area of the city that at one point at least was diminished by putting them in housing. And if I am correct, I mean, some of it has trickled back. And will you just comment, where are we at with mass cast in terms of the population that was there and where that's at now?
I have many complicated and maybe confusing thoughts about mass and CAS. Happens to be we moved our office. Our program, does clinics in most of the shelters, probably 35 shelters, adult and family shelters, and we're spread out and guests in everybody's facility. And then we operate inside both Boston Medical Center and Mass General Hospital, which has been a lifeblood for us. But then we have one building which is our own, which we moved into the old city morgue, which was called the Mallory Institute of Pathology in 2006 or 2008. We started renovating. And right after we moved in, it's right across from the emergency room at Boston Medical Center. Perfect location we have a 104-bed respite care unit where sick homeless people we can take care of 24 hours a day rather than have them in the hospital. And right after we moved in there, I would say 3 years after we moved into the opioid epidemic, sort of the fentanyl and opioid epidemic, really hit Boston, soon followed by methamphetamine, which we had not seen up until sort of the mid-2010s to 15. And then mass and CAS evolved. And I can tell you from the first 20 years I was working on the streets and in the shelters, we rarely saw a tent, for example, in Boston. And if we did see a tent, usually the city, someone from the city or our program or someone with outreach would find that person, figure out what they needed, and move them on and get them a place that would be preferable to a tent. So we didn't see tent cities the way I would see in LA, and then Mass and Cass became that. The complicated thoughts I have about that is, one, it's people desperately in the throes of many things, and it's usually a substance use disorder, but complicated by usually a psychiatric or mental health issue, and because of all that, several medical problems. So it's a real collision of medicine and psychiatry and substance abuse disorders, taking care of that. So that was a challenge for everybody. But then what happened is I worry about the public attitude toward Mass and Cass, because when I think about it, at its worst, there were about 300 people there, terrible, and that they were intense all along, Mass and Cass, then moved to Southampton Street and Atkinson Street. But 300 people, that's out of probably 6,000 or 8,000 homeless people in Boston, so a very small percentage. But the oxygen in the air about homelessness was entirely used up by Mass and Cass. So we realized that the whole public persona, the mayor's race, everything about it was all about, what are you doing about Mass and Cass? And it is a thorny, complicated problem that requires, I think, very complicated solutions. And Mayor Wu, when she came in, did some really fabulous work. First thing of which I think is a little bit what we used to share with Roseanne, and Roseanne has taken on, which is, you've got to know who these people are. You've got to get to know their names. You've got to know who they are and what do they want. You can't just go ahead and say, get out of here. That has clearly failed in every city. And the mayor did that. And then they found optional places for almost everybody there. Got them there. And just what I think it was a stunning success and a real tribute to the mayor. I think what everybody is still struggling with now is, once people go to those places, when they wake up in the morning, where do they go? And their community is back at Mass and Cass. So during the day, you sort of see the community reassembling. So a challenge for, I think, all of us who work in homelessness, whether you're from the political side or the healthcare side or the social work side, is how do you create a community and a sense of purpose for people once you get them into housing? And I think that's what we're still working hard to figure out.
So a challenge that goes on,
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, before we continue, I want to just remind the audience that you can submit questions on the chat box, and we're going to get to them in about 10 minutes. But I want to ask a few more questions while we have Jim kind of under the gun and answering one after the other. So, a paradox for me in Boston is that we have significant homelessness, and some of it is in close proximity to hospitals that would rival anywhere in the world. And the paradox is, how do we treat them? And you mentioned respite care at your Boston Healthcare for the Homeless program. And how long do they stay when you can get them into your respite care? And what comes from that? Can you get them kind of up and going again?
You're right. So I probably should have said you've got me on the ropes now more than anything. I have a picture that I often share with people when I'm talking to students and stuff, that was taken by a woman who's a patient of ours who lived under the Longfellow Bridge for years. She's now actually on our consumer advisory board. And she lived under there, and she had a bunch of street friends, and she took a picture of them right around the turn of the century. It was in the fall of 1999. And I didn't see the picture until she was going in for surgeries about 5 years later. And she asked us to hold on to her stuff. One of the issues we run into all the time, if somebody goes into the hospital or comes into our respite program, they bring everything they own with them. And taking care of that stuff becomes primary for them, much more so than their health. So we've always had to find interesting strategies to hang on and protect people's stuff while they're in the hospital. But she gave me her stuff, and I saw the picture, and I was like, wow, I knew everyone. There were 12 men, I think, in this picture. And they were sitting in a park, and I looked at the picture and I realized I knew all of them. Our team had taken care of these street folks. We knew them. They were, the usual cantankerous, lovable, exasperating, but just, full of just great stories. I looked at the picture and realized this is the average age was about 36 years old. It was 1999, so every one of them is fully insured. Okay, so there's not a lack of insurance. And they're sitting in this park that was like ground zero, sacred territory for us, called Mousy Park, and it's on the grounds of Mass General Hospital. And so I'm looking at this insured group of people sitting in our hospital grounds, and there were 2 of them alive 5 years later.
Wow.
And then I started to realize, look, this is the shadows of, arguably, I adore Mass General. I think it's been amazing for so many things. But here we are, you know, a mortality rate among the people living in our in the shadows that rivals a mortality rate in the most third world of countries.
Wow.
And what is that? I see it as an indictment of not only our healthcare system, but as our thing. We just don't know how to reach to these folks.
Yeah.
But then the complicated thing, the leading cause of death of that group, as we look carefully, was cancer. It was not, you know, what you might expect. And this is before many drug overdoses, you know, and the medical problems, the heart disease, the diabetes, the medical problems were astronomical, but they were almost always accompanied by a relatively severe and persistent mental illness, and almost always an active substance use issue. So the treatment of these folks to try to prevent premature mortality really required all of us to do sort of what Roseanne says you got to do on a city level. We had to, on a medical level, make sure our mental health folks and our substance use folks and our teams had all of those components so you could treat everybody. But that was, I think, an indictment. One of our physician assistants did a study with the rest of our program and found that if you live in the shelters of Boston, you die at 4 times the rate of someone the same age in Boston. That, by the way, has been duplicated in many cities around the country.
Sure.
But if you live on the streets of Boston, as opposed to the shelters, you are 3 times more likely to die than somebody in a shelter, which is 12 to 15 times somebody the same age. So the streets are deadly. And shelters in many ways are kind of life preserving for a while. I don't want to say shelter is the end, but shelter as a staging ground where you're waiting for housing is a much safer place than the streets.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, you make the point that to be on the street is obviously a much, much higher risk than to be in a shelter, and with mortality being very high. Another question I want to ask is, you talked about the opioid epidemic, and that just leads me to ask if you want to say more about that, but also the effect of COVID. How did that hit you, and how have you dealt with it, with COVID?
You know, COVID is a chapter in our program that I think illustrates, at least for me, illustrates what the investment in all these years of evolving has resulted in. So when COVID hit, we've dealt with many, you know, we had tuberculosis, we've had meningitis, meningococcal meningitis, we've had different outbreaks. So we're frequently called by the Department of Public Health, both the city and the state, to help in treating those. So we were sort of geared for, you know, an outbreak of something. But when we started thinking about COVID getting into a shelter where there's 500 people sleeping, we started to really panic. And we spent a lot of time trying to, you know, working with everybody in the state. Talk about calling everybody together. This was, in one way, breathtakingly collaborative. And our program was right at the table with all of the state and city agencies and the shelters, et cetera, and the city for sure. And we learned, to our horror, we were we were screening everybody before they went into the shelter, because we didn't want someone who might have COVID being in there and spreading. So in those early days, remember, if we found somebody who screened positive with, you know, has a cough or a fever, we had to send them somewhere to get a test. The test took about a day to come back. So we had to make sure when somebody went for a test, we had a place for them to be. And then we would only let them into the shelter after they cleared their quarantine or their thing. So what we learned, though, almost our staff, this is not me, our staff learned that, you know, there was an outbreak in one of the shelters where we said, how did that happen? We've been screening everybody. And it turned out we learned, and this is typical, often when you take care of a homeless population, you kind of catch on early to what is going to happen to the thing. And what we found is most of it was asymptomatic. People were coming into the shelter, no symptoms, have COVID. And, you know, at some places, it's been like 60% of all the people with COVID were asymptomatic, even in the beginning. So we realized our whole strategy was wrong. And then our team kind of brilliantly adapted, and we eventually ended up running the, right beside Mass General's 500-bed hospital in the convention center. We had 500 beds that our staff ran for people who had COVID and they could stay as long as it happened. So that long story short, and then when it came time for vaccinating people, we learned a really important lesson I'd love to share with people, that we found that virtually on the street, we were able to get the shots pretty easily. Actually, the Moderna shots worked for us because you didn't have to freeze them the way the Pfizer early on had to be really kept cold. But we were out, and our team, our nurses and physician assistant doctors, started going out and vaccinating people on the street. And to our real surprise, almost no one said no.
That's amazing, yeah.
And I think there was a real community sense of, one, they had seen it firsthand. 40% of everybody in the shelter got COVID, so they knew it was deadly or dangerous. And they seemed to want to protect one another. It was really stunning. I wanted to take them and put them on TV and say, will you explain that to the rest of us? How there is a common good here, a common goal. So that was really, and then the last thing I would say, Peter, this from a personal point of view, I had just turned, I turned 72 when COVID was just hitting. And I got, for the first time in my life, an illness. I got this thing called giant cell arteritis. And I had to be on big doses of steroids and some other immunosuppressants, an IL-6 inhibitor. And I had to stay back. And for the first time in my life, instead of running into the fire, I had to stay back. And it was a real lesson in letting go. And to my both horror and joy, I realized that I was entirely redundant in our program. These young, really amazing doctors and nurses and social workers and dentists just were spectacular. So I, for the first time ever, got that feeling like, God, maybe I'm not so needed anymore. So,
no, I would add too, perhaps, part of the reason that people were so compliant with the vaccine is trust. That you had built up tremendous trust with them, that they believed you and were willing to go down that road.
Yeah, I should have mentioned, you're absolutely right. I think as I was watching, we were giving shots in Mousy Park or down in the subway, but it was a shot being given to them by someone they knew well.
Yeah.
So, if you send someone to a clinic, if you said, go down to the clinic, they give you shots.
They might not have done that.
But someone they know, they would work. It was quite, quite amazing.
So before we get to questions, I have a couple of more reflective questions about perhaps your own personal thinking about all this. And if I were to ask the question, you've been at this maybe for over 30 years, and what have you learned about yourself? This journey that took the path less taken, more or less. Here you are, a highly trained physician, and you go down a road, as you said earlier on, that not many physicians did at that time. And 30 years later, if you look back, what hits you in terms of how did that happen?
I would, I struggle with how to answer that all the time, but the truth is, I didn't get to medical school till I was in my 30. I just turned 30. My mother used to say before she died that I was a delayed vocation, so I remember that from when I was a kid. And I was so happy when I finally, at age 30, found something I really loved and wanted to do. And then I finished residency. I'm already 37 years old. And then this, I got asked to do this 1-year detour. And I was crushed by that because I was already so far behind. I wanted to catch up, I wanted to get my fellowship done and get going. So this I saw as truly just a detour. And at the time, there was no career path in taking care of homeless people. In fact, my experience had been most of the doctors that I had seen when we were working in the hospital who were out taking care of very excluded or marginalized populations, we rapidly marginalized them from our own profession, much to my horror when I think back. So I didn't want that to happen. So I can remember begging my chief of medicine to make sure they kept us in the fold, which to Mass General's credit and Boston Medical Center's credit, they always have. They've embraced us as part of what they do. But then, I went out and started working my year and had this, it wasn't an epiphany because it was a slow, drawn out thing, but the people there were not interested in the do-gooder part of me. They said, look, if you're going to just, be with us for a short time, a year, and we're going to get to know you, and then you're going to get up and do your career somewhere else, you might as well leave now. We don't want to risk that. And I took that to heart because they really were looking for a doctor or a team that would stick with them, not sort of, to be there through thick and thin. And that really wrapped me up. I remember I'm 37, going on 38, trying to figure out, is this a crossroads or not? And I remember asking my chief of medicine if he would delay my fellowship for a second year because I was just getting into this. And then I think I just got caught by these wonderful nurses like Barbara McGinnis and people thinking, you know, they were all like Catholic workers, you know, and third order Franciscans, and
Sure.
and they were dedicated. This was their life. They were dedicated to it. So I think I bit the bullet then and said, all right, I'm going to see if I can't, with the help of a lot of people, carve out a career doing this and try to get some other people to join me.
And you felt, I'm guessing that you felt at that point maybe just comfortable, that you were comfortable in your own skin, that you were on the path you should be on. Does that sound right? Or you're not?
I think even more simply than that, I kind of realized I was loving everything I did. I looked forward to going to work. No day was like the one before. I always was afraid of ennui and boredom and all
Okay.
and that was never even close.
Very nice. Another thing I would just mention, some people who are watching tonight would know that I lived in Central America during civil wars down there, in El Salvador in particular, and a country that was destitute, people with poverty that I had never seen before. And what always struck me was, despite the difficulty of these people's lives, there still could be joy in them. And I'm wondering, do you see the same on the streets of the homeless, that their lives are on some level, objectively you might say, a mess, but on another level these people seem to somehow, at least in my experience of the people who are the outcasts of society, have a joy that is at times very difficult to understand, but it's real.
Yeah. I had a hard time coming to grips with the poverty I was seeing on the streets. People that you see on the streets who may be begging you for a little money, you know, have basically nothing. And if you've got a check, you might have $3 a day or $20 a day at most, and no other funds. So I can remember thinking, wow, this is a really poor population. But then we started to also realize how lonely they were and how alone they were. Yeah. And I had worked a little bit in Haiti for a bit and a little bit in Africa for a bit. And I had the same experience you did. It was utter poverty, but there was joy. The kids were singing and the families were together. And, you know, when people came into the hospital, they came as a family. But I think when you think of an urban homeless population in particular, think of them as poor and really alone. And that transforms everything we think about them for us. So one of the problems for us is we become one of the few stable forces in their lives, and you have to be very careful about, you know, that relationship can become very complicated, but we are there. We're trying to be there through thick and thin, through darkness and light. Yeah. And I think that's what makes most of us in this field really feel, you know, enriched and gratified and blessed to be in their lives.
Yeah. Excellent, excellent. That's a nice answer. So questions are coming, but my final question to you before we take questions is the $500 question that some of these nurses who really formed you at the beginning, Barbara McGinnis in particular, you mentioned, what would you say to her today as you look back 30 years ago or more of the formation you learned or what you learned from her, and what would you say to her today if she were here with us? She has passed away subsequently.
Yeah, Barbara passed away way too young back in 2003, I think it was, and it was about, and our respite program, by the way, and our program we named after Barbara McGinnis, so it's called the McGinnis House. But Barbara, I think if she were here today, she would probably be, you know, Barbara was always unpredictable, but I think she'd be really gratified to see the services that have happened because of what's gone. But at the same time, really angry that we as a society haven't changed a whole lot. Okay. So I can see her blending that thing. I remember Barbara taught me, I may have mentioned to you, Peter, that I remember when all of us, when we start working, become outraged that we as a society allow kids to be in a shelter and people to be sleeping under a bridge. And you just want to scream at the system. And Barbara would look at you and go, man, we got too much work to do right now. Don't scream at the system. We got to fix what we can. And her point was dig in and take care of what's in front of you and dedicate yourself to that. And that's a hard call when you're young and idealistic. But it turned out to be what I think we all learned from her that was very, very important.
Yeah. Okay, we have a question that's come in, and it's really maybe one that a lot of people out there are thinking, you know, how can I, someone who's watching tonight, help in some way to the homeless situation? Anything you would tell them that they might be able to do to give them some sense of hope that they are not just watching, as you said, but really offering something of their own selves to this?
Oh no, I can think of several things to do, and all of which I would add, you know, it's everything helps, and we've got to build this up as a community. So the first thing I would do is actually goes back to what Barbara taught me, and that's never walk by someone and ignore them. Always be sure you look at them. You don't have to give them money or give them, but just acknowledge them. And we have several homeless and formerly homeless people on our board of directors, and they will be the first to tell you that that feeling of being invisible in your own community is really terrifying and lonely. And so just by acknowledging them, Barbara would always acknowledge people by, as she did it more than once, she started asking their name and she said, "Hey John, how you doing?" And it was just to make them feel part of your world. So that, I think, is supremely important. Sounds trivial, but it's really important. The other thing is, there's all sorts of wonderful organizations to give money to that are really doing remarkable things. But for example, in our program, when I think of what really makes a difference for us as doctors and nurses is that extra time we have to spend with people, which of course is not valued by Medicaid or any of the payers. So to carve out that time, we really depend on donations to give us that extra space, and I think that makes all the difference. And then volunteering with different organizations. We certainly love having volunteers at our McGinnis House in our spot. So if you look under, if you look up, I think we're bhchp.org, and there's a whole list of things that you would be interested in doing.
Okay, well, that's good then, so that they could actually contact Boston Healthcare for the homeless program, and they'd make contact with somebody who could plug them into something if they were interested.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. So another one really would be this idea that what do you see the future now? Is there a new generation? You've done this for 30 years. Is there another generation coming? Physicians, nurses, social workers who are as dedicated, or in the younger, when I say younger, I mean perhaps people under 40, who would have the idealism that perhaps people of our generation grew up with in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, I think no doubt, and I am, if it's something that makes me feel satisfied going ahead. I know the problem will be recalcitrant for a long time, but we're going to work on it. But the number of young, doctors, nurses, physician assistants, social workers, psychiatrists and mental health, the number of them who have been really interested in this kind of work and who have come and, either done rotations as students with us, but then taken jobs with us is quite extraordinary. So, I sit back and realize we just laid a little bit of groundwork, and they are taking everything to a whole new level. We now have, I think we have 35 physicians working with us full time.
Full time. Okay.
Yeah, full time, and probably 40 nurse practitioners and PAs, and well over 100 nurses, and they were all spending their lives trying to figure out better ways to take care of homeless people.
And is there formation for these people, medical students and nursing training? Are they getting some formation related to healthcare for people who are homeless, as opposed to us maybe who didn't?
Yeah, no, there was no learning for us for sure. It was all throw you into the fire. But now I think there are programs around the country that are healthcare for the homeless programs and other programs, but ours in particular, if I can speak selfishly, we have nursing students from the local nursing schools who come and do rotations with us. The psychiatry residents at Mass General, for example, all spend time on the street with us. And most of the primary care residents at both Boston Medical Center and Mass General, and some from the Brigham, also spend time with us. And that they then become the people who are most likely to be the ones who will take a job with us later on.
And you see that they do. Some of them will come in.
Oh, absolutely. For example, Denise de las Mesas, who's our current chief medical officer, went to Harvard Medical School, trained at the Brigham, did some rotations with us, did a fellowship, and then is now with us. Monica Burrell, who was the former commissioner of public health, was our medical director for 15 years, and she was a chief resident at Boston Medical Center. Jesse Gaeta, another one. They're just phenomenally good people, trained really well, whose focus is caring for those who are excluded. It's quite extraordinary.
Very nice, very nice. A question has just come in again now. What might be some reasons that people on the street would not go to a shelter? A lot of people will say, there's shelters available, they just don't go. Why don't they go?
Yeah, many different reasons.
Yeah.
There are some simple ones that, most of the shelters do not allow couples to be together. So if you're in a relationship and don't want to split up at night, you're really pretty much have to stay outside, which is something I hope we can address sometime in the future. Then there are people who, can't be in a room with 500 other people. It's just too tense and anxiety provoking, so they stay outside for their freedom. And there are an awful lot of people who are on the streets because they can't sit still. They can't be in a room, and caged in. It's a problem we have when they come to the hospital as well. Being in a hospital is very difficult for many of the people who live on the streets. You have to stay in bed, stay in your room for days at a time, and that can be overwhelmingly difficult for people.
Wow.
So we've come to learn that the reasons are, we almost don't even ask anymore because the reasons are usually very complicated, and are buried somewhere in a history of abuse or in a history of some mental illness that we don't quite understand yet.
Okay. Another question we have is there a relationship between homelessness and oppression or inequality in society? People of color, different religions that might not be quite as acceptable as some others. Do you see any kind of a connection between the two?
There's I think, a deep and troubling relationship of both poverty and racism with homelessness.
Okay.
And with all of the things that we've been talking about. So racism plays a very, very critical role. I can give you an example that, like many years ago, while the street population that we see on the streets of Boston pretty much mirrors the population demographically of Boston as a whole. So it's almost as if people fall through.
Yeah.
But when you look at homeless families, it's predominantly families of color. So you know that there's some awful mechanism that structurally is pushing families into homelessness that is based on some racist policies, knowing or not. But I think that's something everybody is working on. I do know that when you look at the numbers from the HUD thing, the numbers of people, the percentage of people who are Black is about twice the national average. So you know that you're twice as likely to become homeless if you're Black. So there is clearly structural racism. I think almost everybody, I should add that, I can barely remember finding someone on the streets who just wanted to be on the streets. Sure. And as you get to know folks, you realize that the stories of abuse, emotional, physical, sexual, the stories of growing up in blighted neighborhoods, growing up in foster care, being in a school system that didn't recognize their ADD or their learning disability, all of those structural failures back when they were children end up with somebody being on the streets when they're 35 and 40. And we're starting to realize that the solution to that is to fix those things if we're going to stem the flow coming. We have to house the people that are out there now and take care of them. But if we're going to stop it from happening, so I have really fallen into this thing of urging people to think of this as one big overarching problem, but two issues. One is, how do you prevent and stop homelessness in the future, which requires us as a society really looking hard at ourselves and the social justice issues afoot, poverty, racism, all of that. But then there's the other issue, which I think we have to hold both in our hands. There's 500,000 people tonight who are out on the streets who aren't going to find housing for the next, it's going to take 5 or 10 or 15 years to find their housing. Who takes care of them while they're out there? And you can't blame them for being there. It's not their fault. But we do, I think, have an obligation to take care of them, even if it's expensive. And I think too often people do either one or the other, and I think we've got to do both.
Wow. Okay, a final question before we wrap it up is that you've been at this a long time. Do you see yourself continuing on for a while more? And in the program you've established, it would sound like you have leadership that would come after you going forward. Where do you see yourself going in the next 5 years? Do you think you continue on? Do you have the energy to continue on at the level you're at now?
Yeah, no, I've learned, as we all have, that I turned 75 a few weeks ago, and you realize that, as one of my roommates said, we're playing with house money now, and so I have a huge respect for, things are going to change health-wise and situation-wise. So I still love what I do. I particularly love it now because I've been able to step back a little bit and watch, like, for example, the street team, which is my clinical home. We have these young people, they've taken it to such another level than when I was, and I'm like the utility player on the team now, not the leader anymore. And that is really gratifying. And so I think I'm leaning towards saying, how do I slow down and read some books and maybe do some writing or something like that, and accept that maybe, it's good for a 75-year-old doctor to step back and not not be on the front lines.
Well, that's great. So anyway, okay, as we finish up then, I just want to remind everybody that a new book, Rough Sleepers by Tracy Kidder, had come out in this past several months, and the story of really Jim's work on behalf of the homeless in Boston, and a worthwhile read, so you can look that one up. And Jim also has a book of his own, Stories from the Shadows, Reflections of a Street Doctor. That's another one that you probably worthwhile taking a look at. So with that, let me then just thank first and foremost Dr. Jim O'Connell for his time tonight. He's a busy man, there's in demand. He's been speaking at a lot of different places, and we are very grateful for his time with us tonight and to share his story. And it's really quite an amazing story, and one that's quite inspirational for all of us. So thank you very much.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you, Peter. I really appreciate it.
And I also want to thank our viewing audience that we appreciate very much your dialing in when we run these fireside chats. We try to make them informative so that we can raise consciousness, as I said at the beginning, about issues that really are affecting human beings and how we might be able to work towards some kind of solutions towards them. So again, thank you very much. We've enjoyed having you here. And I'll just make one final plea that these programs that we run are really free to everybody. And I'd advise you, or ask you, implore you maybe to take a look at our webpage at a faith-justice.org and take a look at the work we're doing. We really enjoy your accompaniment with us as we go forward, trying to reach out to people in need. So thank you and have a wonderful evening, and hope to see you soon. And thank you again, Jim.
Thank you.
For being here.